When 17-year-old Jazara Bennett heard the words "life in prison" echo through that cold courtroom, she knew her childhood was over. But what the judge didn't know was that one phone call would bring down his entire corrupt system. Because her father wasn't just any man. He was Malcolm Bennett, the United States Attorney General. The gavel's crack shattered the silence like a gunshot. Judge Harrison's voice dripped with contempt as he leaned forward, his weathered face twisted into a mask of disgust. Jazara Bennett, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words hit her chest like a physical blow. Her hands trembled in the metal shackles. 17 years old and drowning in a sea of hostile gasped. The courtroom gasped. Her grandmother's cry pierced the air. But Jazara sat frozen, watching her entire future crumble into ash in that single, devastating moment. 3 hours later, in a concrete holding cell that smelled of bleach and despair, Jazara's fingers shook as she dialed the number she'd memorized but rarely used. The phone rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered, deep, steady, the voice that used to read her bedtime stories before the world got complicated. "Dad?" Her voice cracked like broken glass. "Jazara?" Malcolm Bennett's tone was calm, but she could hear the storm building beneath. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "They gave me life." The words fell from her lips like stones into still water. "Dad, they gave me life in prison for defending myself." Silence stretched between them, not empty, but full of a father's love and fury colliding. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of every injustice he'd ever fought. "I'm coming, baby girl, and I'm bringing the entire federal government with me." Malcolm Bennett wasn't just any concerned father making frantic phone calls to lawyers. He was the United States Attorney General, the most powerful law enforcement officer in America. The man who could mobilize federal marshals with a single phone call, who had the ear of the president and the authority to challenge any court in the nation. For 15 years, he'd climbed the ranks of the justice system, prosecuting white-collar criminals and fighting for civil rights cases that others wouldn't touch. He'd broken up corruption rings, taken down powerful politicians, and earned a reputation as the conscience of American law enforcement. His office in Washington overlooked the Supreme Court building, a daily reminder of the sacred trust placed in his hands. But none of that mattered now. Not his achievements, not his reputation, not the cases pending on his desk that affected millions of Americans. All that mattered was his daughter's broken voice on the other end of that phone line, and the system he'd devoted his life to serving had just failed her in the most brutal way possible. The Attorney General of the United States was about to become something far more dangerous, a father with unlimited resources and nothing left to lose. Jazara's case wasn't unique. It was part of a horrifying pattern plaguing courtrooms across America. Every year, thousands of black children faced adult sentences for crimes that would earn white teenagers therapy and community service. The school-to-prison pipeline had evolved into something worse, a fast track from trauma to life sentences, where survival instincts were criminalized and self-defense became murder in the eyes of biased judges. Judge Harrison had a record that civil rights groups had been tracking for years. 83% of his life sentences went to defendants of color. His courtroom was where hope went to die, where children who'd already been failed by every system meant to protect them received their final punishment from a society that had given up on them. The private prison industry loved judges like Harrison. Every life sentence meant guaranteed revenue for decades, young bodies filling cells, generating profits while families destroyed and communities bled. It was modern slavery dressed in legal robes, and everyone knew it. But challenging judges required resources, political connections, and power that most families simply didn't possess. What they didn't know was that this particular 17-year-old girl had connections that reached the highest levels of government. Her father had spent his career dismantling corruption, exposing injustice, and holding the powerful accountable. He'd taken on senators, governors, and Fortune 500 CEOs. But he'd never fought a battle this personal, this urgent, this absolutely critical to his own soul. The system was about to learn what happens when you sentence the wrong man's daughter. Within 24 hours, federal investigators would descend on Judge Harrison's courthouse like a plague of locusts, armed with subpoenas and decades of prosecutorial experience. They would discover connections between private prisons and judicial decisions that would shock the nation. Jazara's case would expose a web of corruption stretching from local police departments to the highest levels of state government. But more than that, it would transform a broken girl into a powerful voice for justice and turn a father's love into a weapon that would reshape the American legal system forever. If you believe that every child deserves justice, that the system should protect our most vulnerable instead of devouring them, then subscribe to our channel for more stories that expose injustice and celebrate triumph. Your support helps us shine light on the cases others won't touch. Jazara was only 4 when her mother, Keisha, walked out of their apartment on a Tuesday morning and never came back. No goodbye kiss, no explanation, just an empty closet and a note on the kitchen counter that read, "I can't do this anymore. Take care of our girl." Malcolm found that note when he rushed home from a federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, still wearing his prosecutor's suit, his tie loosened from another 16-hour day building cases against organized crime. He'd been so focused on bringing justice to strangers that he'd missed the signs of his own wife's crumbling mental health, the sleepless nights, the distant stares, the way she'd stopped singing lullabies to their little girl. "Where's Mommy?" Jazara asked that evening, clutching her favorite stuffed elephant while Malcolm struggled to heat up chicken nuggets without burning them. Her wide brown eyes searched his face for answers he didn't have. "Mommy had to go away, sweetheart," he whispered, kneeling down to her level. "But Daddy's here. Daddy will always be here." It was a promise he met with every fiber of his being, but keeping it would prove harder than prosecuting the most complex federal cases. Single fatherhood hit him like a freight train. Ballet lessons and bedtime stories squeezed between court appearances and late-night case preparations. He hired nannies, but they never lasted long. Jazara was a bright, sensitive child who needed more than paid caregivers could provide. She needed her father's attention, his presence, his unconditional love. But the demands of his rising career kept pulling him away from the one person who needed him most. The Rosewood neighborhood where Malcolm bought their modest 3-bedroom house seemed perfect on paper. Tree-lined streets, decent schools, middle-class families trying to build better lives. But beneath the surface, predators lurked in positions of trust, hunting for vulnerable children whose parents worked long hours. Mr. Rodriguez, the elderly man who ran the corner store, always had extra candy for little girls who visited alone. His weathered hands lingered too long when giving change, and his compliments about how pretty and grown-up young girls looked made mothers uncomfortable. But he was respected in the community, a business owner, a church regular, so complaints were whispered rather than reported. The youth center director, Coach Williams, had mastered the art of grooming through sports. He'd single out girls from broken homes, offering extra attention and special training sessions after hours. He knew exactly which children craved adult approval, which ones would stay silent to avoid losing the only adult who seemed to care about their achievements. Parents grateful for free childcare rarely questioned why their daughters came home quiet and withdrawn. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who babysat for working parents, ran what she called a safe house for neighborhood kids. But safety was conditional. Children who didn't follow her increasingly inappropriate rules faced punishment that went far beyond typical discipline. She threatened to call Child Protective Services on parents who questioned her methods, weaponizing the very system meant to protect children. These adults formed an invisible network of exploitation, trading information about which children were most vulnerable, which parents were too busy or overwhelmed to notice changes in behavior. They preyed on kids like Jazara, bright, hungry for attention, desperate to please the adults in their lives. When Jazara turned 11, she started walking home from school alone. The 15-minute journey became a gauntlet of uncomfortable encounters. Mr. Rodriguez calling her over for special treats, Coach Williams offering rides when it rained, Mrs. Patterson insisting she stop by to check on things when Malcolm worked late. Jazara learned to navigate these interactions with the survival instincts that children develop when adults fail them. She became hyper-aware of exit strategies, learned to deflect inappropriate comments with nervous laughter, mastered the art of appearing compliant while protecting herself. But each encounter chipped away at her sense of safety, teaching her that the adult world was full of people who saw her not as a child to protect, but as an object to exploit. Malcolm's career trajectory was everything he'd dreamed of: federal prosecutor to regional director to finally being nominated for attorney general. Each promotion meant more responsibility, higher stakes, and longer hours away from home. He told himself he was building a better future for Jazara, fighting for justice that would benefit children like her across the nation. But the irony was crushing. While he spent 18-hour days protecting other people's children from trafficking rings and exploitation, his own daughter was learning to protect herself from predators in their own neighborhood. The phone calls from school administrators became routine. Jazara seems tired lately. Her grades are slipping. She's been getting into fights with other students. Malcolm would promise to talk to her, to pay more attention, to be more present. But another case would land on his desk. Another corrupt politician to prosecute, another criminal organization to dismantle, and his good intentions would dissolve under the weight of professional obligations. He hired housekeepers, tutors, and after-school supervisors, believing that money could substitute for his presence. When Jazara stopped talking about her day, he assumed it was normal teenage behavior. When she became withdrawn and jumpy around adult men, he attributed it to adolescent moodiness. When she started staying out late and hanging around older teenagers, he scheduled a lecture about responsibility instead of asking what she was running from. The bitter truth was that Malcolm Bennett, champion of justice and protector of the vulnerable, was failing the most important case of his life. Every criminal he put behind bars was a victory for justice, but every night he came home to find his daughter already asleep, another conversation postponed, another opportunity to connect missed. He was saving everyone's children except his own. By 15, Jazara had learned that adults were either absent, predatory, or powerless to protect her. Her father lived in a world of legal briefs and federal cases, present in body but absent in understanding. The few teachers who noticed her struggles were overwhelmed by overcrowded classrooms and underfunded programs. Social workers were overloaded with cases, seeing symptoms but missing the deeper patterns of community-wide failure. The older teenagers she'd started hanging around weren't much better than the adults, but at least they were honest about their intentions. They offered acceptance in exchange for participation in increasingly risky activities. They taught her that survival meant never showing weakness, never trusting authority, never expecting protection from people who claimed to care. Jazara's resilience became her prison. She was so good at appearing fine that no one looked deeper. Her grades were decent enough to avoid attention. Her behavior was compliant enough to avoid concern. She'd mastered the art of invisible suffering, crying only in locked bathrooms and empty rooms. The child who once ran into her father's arms for comfort had transformed into a teenager who handled her pain alone, convinced that asking for help was pointless because the adults in her life were either too busy, too corrupt, or too broken to provide it. This story raises difficult questions about how we protect our children from predators who hide behind positions of trust and respect in our communities. Too often, we focus on stranger danger while ignoring the familiar faces who exploit vulnerable kids. Comment below and share your thoughts. How do we create communities where children feel safe reporting inappropriate behavior? How do we balance supporting hardworking parents like Malcolm while ensuring kids don't fall through the cracks? Your insights could help other families recognize warning signs and build stronger support networks for our most precious and vulnerable community members. October 15th started like any other Tuesday, but by evening, the sky had turned the color of old bruises. Thunder rolled across Chicago's South Side in waves, and lightning split the darkness with violent flashes that made the shadows dance. Rain hammered against the windows of the small apartment where 17-year-old Jazara sat alone, trying to focus on her chemistry homework. Malcolm was in Washington for an emergency Senate hearing about prison reform, the kind of high-stakes meeting that kept him away for days at a time. The house felt different when he was gone, emptier somehow, as if his absence created spaces for danger to creep in through the cracks. Jazara's phone buzzed with text messages she'd been dreading for weeks. Each notification made her stomach clench tighter. She'd tried to ignore them, tried to block the number, but he always found new ways to reach her. The messages were getting more demanding, more threatening. Tonight, they carried an ultimatum she could no longer avoid. Outside, the storm intensified. Tree branches scraped against the siding like fingernails on glass. The power flickered once, twice, leaving her in momentary darkness before the lights came back on. Everything felt charged with electricity and dread, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what was about to happen. At 9:47 p.m., 3 sharp knocks shattered the quiet. Jazara's blood turned to ice water. She knew who it was before she looked through the peephole. Marcus Cole stood on her doorstep, his bulk filling the frame, rain dripping from his jacket. At 38, he was old enough to be her father, but he'd never seen her that way. For 2 years, he'd been circling her like a shark, using his position as a community mentor to gain access to vulnerable teenagers. He volunteered at the youth center, coached girls' basketball, and had earned the trust of parents who were grateful for any positive male influence in their daughters' lives. But behind his public persona lay something much darker. Marcus had spent months grooming Jazara, starting with innocent compliments about her intelligence and maturity. He'd offered rides home from school when it rained, bought her gifts just because, and gradually isolated her from friends who might ask uncomfortable questions. He'd convinced her that their special relationship was normal, even flattering, that older men paid attention to her because she was more mature than other girls her age. "Open the door, Jazz," his voice carried through the wood, calm but with an edge that made her hands shake. "We need to talk." Jazara pressed her back against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. For months, she'd managed to keep their interactions public, at school, at the youth center, places where other people could see. But recently, his demands had escalated. He wanted private time, alone time, and he'd made it clear that refusing wasn't an option. "I know you're in there," Marcus continued, his tone shifting from friendly to impatient. "Your daddy's not here to protect you anymore. Just you and me, like it should be." The knocking became more insistent, harder, the sound echoing through the apartment like gunshots. Lightning illuminated his shadow through the frosted glass, making him look like a monster from childhood nightmares. "I've been patient with you, Jazz, more patient than you deserve, but my patience is running out." His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "You know what happens to girls who don't appreciate kindness. You've seen what happened to the others." The others. Jazara's stomach lurched as she remembered the whispered stories of girls who'd crossed Marcus, who'd tried to report him or resist his advances. They'd been labeled troublemakers, kicked out of programs, their reputations destroyed. Some had disappeared entirely from the neighborhood. She was trapped, and they both knew it. Jazara's trembling hands fumbled with the lock. She knew that not answering would only make things worse. Marcus had keys to the youth center, connections throughout the neighborhood, and a talent for making problems disappear. Opening the door felt like signing her own death warrant, but leaving it closed might be even more dangerous. The moment the bolt clicked open, Marcus pushed his way inside, his massive frame filling the narrow hallway. The smell of alcohol and cologne hit her like a physical blow. His eyes were different tonight. Hungrier, more dangerous. The mask of mentorship had slipped completely away. "There's my good girl," he said, reaching out to touch her face. His fingers were cold and damp from the rain. "I knew you'd see reason." Jazara flinched away, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway was too narrow, and Marcus blocked the only exit. Behind her stretched the small apartment, a kitchen, living room, and bedroom with no other way out. She was a mouse caught in a trap, and the cat was done playing. "Please," she whispered, hating how small her voice sounded. "My dad will be home soon." Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. "Your daddy's in Washington, testifying about prison reform. Ironic, isn't it?" fighting to keep criminals out of jail while his little girl learns what the real world is like. He stepped closer and Jazara's back hit the wall. His breath was hot against her face, reeking of whiskey and violence. The apartment felt like it was shrinking around them, the walls closing in until there was nothing left but predator and prey. "You've been teasing me for months, Jazz, acting innocent, playing hard to get. But we both know you want this. Girls like you always do." What happened next unfolded in fragments, like a movie played in slow motion with half the frames missing. Marcus's hands grabbed her shoulders, his grip brutal enough to leave bruises. Jazara's mind split in two, part of her floating above the scene like a frightened observer, the other part pure animal instinct screaming for survival. She'd endured months of his psychological manipulation, but this physical assault shattered something fundamental inside her. No. The word tore from her throat like a battle cry. Her knee connected with his groin, sending him stumbling backward into the coffee table. Books and picture frames crashed to the floor. Marcus's face contorted with rage. "You little—" He lunged at her again, his bulk crashing into her with the force of a linebacker. They hit the floor together, his weight pinning her down, his hands reaching for her throat. Terror gave way to fury. Jazara's fingers closed around something sharp, a piece of broken picture frame, the glass edge cutting into her palm even as she gripped it tighter. Malcolm's voice echoed in her memory from years of self-defense conversations. "If someone tries to hurt you, you fight back with everything you have." The glass shard found its target in Marcus's neck. Arterial blood sprayed across the white walls in crimson arcs. His eyes went wide with shock, then confusion, then nothing at all. Silence fell like a curtain, broken only by Jazara's ragged breathing and the rain still hammering against the windows. The police arrived 47 minutes later, responding to a neighbor's report of screaming and crashing sounds. They found Jazara sitting in the corner of her living room, covered in blood that wasn't hers, staring at Marcus Cole's body with the hollow gaze of someone whose childhood had just ended. Officer Bradley took one look at the scene and made his assessment. Black teenager, dead white man, blood everywhere. The story wrote itself in his mind before he'd even taken statements. He didn't see a terrified girl who'd fought for her life. He saw a criminal who needed to be processed. The handcuffs clicked around Jazara's wrists with cold finality. No one asked about her injuries, her trauma, or what had led to this moment. No one noticed the texts on her phone or the bruises on her arms. The system had already decided who was victim and who was perpetrator, and 17-year-old Jazara Bennett was definitely the latter. But this was just the beginning of her nightmare. The real horror wouldn't be the blood on her hands or the memory of Marcus's final breath. It would be watching a system designed to protect the innocent transform her from victim to monster with the stroke of a prosecutor's pen. Detective Raymond Mills arrived at the crime scene with his mind already made up. 22 years on the Chicago PD had taught him to read situations quickly, and this one seemed obvious. Dead white community leader, living black teenager, case closed. He spent 12 minutes examining Marcus Cole's body, and 47 minutes building a narrative that would stick in court. The evidence that didn't fit Mills's predetermined story was either ignored or dismissed. Marcus's phone contained months of increasingly threatening text messages to Jazara, but Mills labeled them normal mentor communication. The youth center's security footage showing Marcus following teenage girls to isolated areas was deemed irrelevant to this case. 3 other girls who tried to report Marcus's inappropriate behavior were never interviewed, their statements buried in files marked unsubstantiated claims. Mills focused exclusively on evidence that supported premeditated murder. He photographed the blood spatter patterns but ignored the defensive wounds on Jazara's hands. He documented Marcus's injuries in detail but glossed over the bruises on Jazara's throat and shoulders. The broken picture frame became a weapon of choice rather than something grabbed in desperation. Most damaging was what Mills chose not to investigate. He never spoke with neighbors who'd witnessed Marcus's pattern of targeting vulnerable girls. He didn't interview other youth center participants who could have testified about Marcus's inappropriate behavior. He never examined Marcus's computer, which contained searches for how to silence accusers and teenage psychology manipulation. Instead, Mills crafted a story that transformed a predator into a victim and a victim into a cold-blooded killer. His report painted Marcus as a respected community leader who'd made the mistake of trying to help a troubled teenager. Jazara became the aggressor, a girl from a broken home who'd lured an innocent man to his death. The investigation was closed within 72 hours, Rush delivered to prosecutors who were all too eager to make an example of another dangerous black youth. Public defender James Morrison received Jazara's case file on a Friday afternoon, buried beneath 47 other cases demanding immediate attention. With only 3 days to prepare for arraignment, he skimmed the police report while eating lunch at his desk, already calculating how to negotiate a plea deal that would clear another case from his impossible workload. Morrison was a decent man, destroyed by an indecent system. Fresh out of law school 15 years earlier, he'd entered public defense with noble intentions and genuine passion for justice. But Cook County's public defender's office was a machine designed to process poor defendants as quickly as possible, not to provide adequate representation. With over 200 active cases, Morrison averaged 11 minutes per client, barely enough time to learn their names, let alone mount effective defenses. When Morrison finally met Jazara in the county jail's concrete visitation room, he had 17 minutes before his next client interview. He saw a shell-shocked teenager who could barely speak above a whisper, but he didn't have time to address trauma or build trust. Instead, he launched into a practiced speech about plea bargaining. "The prosecution has solid evidence," he explained, shuffling through papers that represented months of Marcus Cole's predatory behavior reduced to bureaucratic summaries. "Self-defense is hard to prove. Your best option is manslaughter, with a recommendation for leniency due to your age." Morrison never investigated the youth center's records. He never interviewed the other girls Marcus had targeted. He never consulted trauma specialists who could explain how abuse victims respond under extreme stress. He had neither the time nor resources to build the case Jazara deserved. Instead, he filed standard motions, requested standard extensions, and prepared for a standard plea negotiation. Jazara Bennett became another file in an overburdened system, another teenager failed by lawyers too overwhelmed to fight and too tired to care. District Attorney Patricia Hawkins saw Jazara's case as a career opportunity wrapped in moral outrage. With re-election looming and crime statistics dominating headlines, she needed high-profile convictions that would prove her tough on-crime credentials to suburban voters terrified of urban violence. Hawkins transformed Marcus Cole from predator to saint with the skill of a master storyteller. In press conferences and court filings, she painted him as a selfless community volunteer who devoted his life to helping at-risk youth. She highlighted his coaching record, his church attendance, and his volunteer hours while completely ignoring the mounting evidence of his predatory behavior. Marcus Cole died trying to save a troubled girl from herself, Hawkins declared to news cameras, her voice heavy with manufactured grief. He saw Jazara Bennett heading down a dangerous path and reached out with compassion. His reward was a knife to the throat from someone he was trying to help. The prosecution's strategy was character assassination, disguised as justice. They portrayed Jazara as a manipulative seductress who'd lured Marcus to her apartment with promises of sexual favors, then killed him in cold blood when he refused her advances. They pointed to her father's absence as evidence of a broken home that had produced a dangerous sociopath. When the defense tried to introduce evidence of Marcus's pattern of abuse, Hawkins objected on grounds of relevance. When trauma experts attempted to explain how abuse victims respond to life-threatening situations, she dismissed their testimony as junk science. When other girls tried to testify about Marcus's inappropriate behavior, Hawkins successfully argued that their unsubstantiated allegations would unfairly prejudice the jury. Most devastatingly, Hawkins used Jazara's survival instincts against her. The fact that she'd fought back became evidence of premeditation. Her ability to articulate what happened became proof of calculated deception. Her refusal to show emotion in court was presented as callous indifference to Marcus's death. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hawkins declared in her closing argument, "we're not here to relitigate every poor choice this defendant has made. We're here because a good man is dead and his killer sits before you, unrepentant and unashamed. Jazara Bennett chose violence when she could have chosen words. She chose murder when she could have chosen mercy. The only question is whether you'll choose justice." The prosecution had successfully transformed a case of clear self-defense into premeditated murder, and the defense was powerless to stop it. Judge William Harrison had built his reputation on harsh sentences for young offenders, believing that swift, severe punishment would deter others from following similar paths. His courtroom walls displayed framed newspaper clippings celebrating his tough love approach to juvenile crime, and his sentencing guidelines consistently exceeded state recommendations. Harrison's bias was evident from jury selection. He allowed prosecutors to dismiss 3 potential black jurors for attitude concerns, while seating white suburbanites who'd already formed opinions about the case based on media coverage. He ruled defense motions inadmissible while granting every prosecution request, creating a trial environment that favored conviction over truth. During testimony, Harrison's body language communicated his feelings clearly. He leaned forward attentively when prosecutors spoke but checked his watch during defense arguments. He allowed Hawkins to object repeatedly to trauma testimony while overruling Morrison's attempts to challenge prosecution evidence. When expert witnesses tried to explain the psychological effects of prolonged abuse on teenage victims, Harrison cut them short. "This court is interested in facts, not excuses," he declared, his voice dripping with disdain. The defendant had choices, and she chose violence. Harrison's sentencing speech revealed his true feelings about Jazara and defendants like her. "You represent everything wrong with today's youth," he said, staring down at her with undisguised contempt. "No respect for authority, no regard for life, no acceptance of responsibility. This court sentences you to life in prison without possibility of parole. Maybe that will send a message to others who think violence is the answer." The words hit the packed courtroom like a physical blow. Jazara's grandmother collapsed in her seat, her anguished wail echoing off the marble walls. Community members who'd come to support her sat in stunned silence, unable to process the severity of the sentence. Even courthouse veterans, bailiffs and clerks who'd witnessed thousands of proceedings, exchanged shocked glances. Several jury members looked uncomfortable, as if realizing too late that their verdict would result in such harsh consequences. In the gallery, teenagers from Jazara's neighborhood wept openly, seeing their own potential futures reflected in her shackled figure. Share this story if you believe in true justice, not the kind that destroys children to protect predators, but the kind that seeks truth over convenient narratives. Every share helps expose the systemic failures that turn victims into criminals, while protecting those who abuse their power. The Cook County Jail holding cell smelled like disinfectant and despair. Jazara sat on the thin mattress, her back against the cold concrete wall, staring at the single phone mounted near the steel door. For 3 hours, she'd been gathering the courage to make the call that would either save her or destroy the last relationship that mattered. She'd been allowed one phone call after her arrest, but she'd used it to contact her grandmother, hoping somehow that familiar voice could make sense of the nightmare. Grandma Rose had wept through the entire conversation, promising to find a way to help, while knowing she had no resources to fight a system determined to crush them. Now, watching other inmates come and go, Jazara realized she had one card left to play, a card she'd avoided using for years because it felt like admitting failure. Her father had built his career fighting for justice, and here she was, the poster child for everything he dedicated his life to preventing. But desperation has a way of stripping away pride. With trembling fingers, Jazara dialed the private number she'd memorized but rarely used, the direct line to the Attorney General's office that bypassed all secretaries and security protocols, the number reserved for true emergencies. Her heart hammered as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Malcolm Bennett. The voice was crisp, professional, distracted by whatever crisis had been occupying his attention before the phone rang. "Dad?" Jazara's voice cracked like glass under pressure. The change was immediate and profound. 20 years of prosecutorial training vanished, replaced by raw paternal instinct. "Jazara? Sweetheart, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" "They sentenced me to life, Dad." The words came out in a broken whisper. "Life in prison for defending myself against." Her voice shattered completely. Malcolm Bennett, the man who'd interrogated senators and stared down Supreme Court justices without flinching, felt his world collapse around those 7 words. His daughter, his brilliant, beautiful daughter, was calling from jail with a life sentence hanging over her head. "Where are you right now?" His voice remained calm through sheer force of will, but his free hand was already reaching for the secure phone that would mobilize federal resources within minutes. "Cook County." "Dad, I killed someone, but he was trying to." "Stop," Malcolm interrupted gently. "Don't say another word over this line. I'm coming to Chicago tonight with the best legal team in the country. You hold on, baby girl. Daddy's coming, and we're going to fix this." For the first time in 72 hours, Jazara felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Within 10 minutes of hanging up, Malcolm's office transformed into a war room. His chief of staff, Diana Martinez, canceled his entire schedule and began making calls that would reshape the Chicago legal landscape overnight. Federal marshals were dispatched to secure case files. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division launched an emergency review of the prosecution. Malcolm's personal legal team, the same attorneys who'd taken down governors and crime families, received urgent summons to Chicago. Sarah Chen, the nation's foremost expert on prosecutorial misconduct, boarded a government jet from San Francisco. David Rodriguez, whose expertise in juvenile justice reform had influenced Supreme Court decisions, left his Harvard classroom mid-lecture to join the fight. But Malcolm knew legal expertise alone wouldn't be enough. This case required political pressure, media attention, and community mobilization on a scale rarely seen outside of presidential campaigns. He called in favors accumulated over 2 decades of public service, reaching out to civil rights leaders, investigative journalists, and activist organizations. The private prison industry's stock prices began dropping within hours as word leaked that the Attorney General was personally investigating connections between judicial sentencing and corporate profits. Phone calls flooded congressional offices from constituents demanding answers about systemic racism in juvenile sentencing. Malcolm's media strategy was surgical and devastating. Rather than holding traditional press conferences, he provided exclusive access to trusted journalists who'd been investigating judicial corruption for years. Court documents that had been buried or dismissed were suddenly front-page news. Marcus Cole's history of predatory behavior, carefully hidden by local officials, was exposed in exhaustive detail. Most importantly, Malcolm activated the network of families who'd lost children to unjust sentences. Mothers and fathers who'd been fighting the system individually were suddenly part of a coordinated campaign led by the most powerful prosecutor in America. Their pain became a weapon for change. The story exploded across social media faster than traditional news outlets could process it. Within 6 hours, #Justice for Jazara was trending nationally, propelled by a perfect storm of public outrage and political timing. The image of a 17-year-old girl sentenced to life for defending herself against a predator struck a nerve that transcended racial and political boundaries. Celebrity activists with millions of followers shared the story. Professional athletes used their platform to demand justice. Musicians dedicated performances to Jazara's case, and their fans responded with donations to legal defense funds and calls to elected officials. But the most powerful response came from ordinary people who recognized themselves in Jazara's story. Mothers who'd struggled to protect their daughters from predatory men. Fathers who'd worked long hours while their children faced dangers they never imagined. Teenagers who'd survived abuse only to be blamed for their own victimization. Vigils spontaneously organized in cities across the country. College students held protests demanding judicial reform. Church congregations prayed for Jazara by name and organized letter-writing campaigns to challenge prosecutorial abuse. The Chicago mayor's office received over 50,000 calls in 24 hours. The governor faced protesters outside his mansion demanding intervention. Even international human rights organizations began monitoring the case, comparing America's treatment of juvenile offenders to practices in authoritarian regimes. What had started as a father's desperate attempt to save his daughter had evolved into a national referendum on juvenile justice, prosecutorial misconduct, and the school-to-prison pipeline. District Attorney Patricia Hawkins watched her political career crumble in real time. The same media outlets that had praised her tough-on-crime approach now dissected her prosecution methods with forensic precision. Ethics complaints poured into her office faster than her staff could process them. Judge Harrison, facing an emergency judicial review and potential removal from the bench, suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts that would delay any public appearances. The Cook County Sheriff quietly transferred Jazara to protective custody after receiving credible threats against her safety. Detective Mills found himself under federal investigation for evidence tampering and witness intimidation. The youth center where Marcus Cole had operated faced congressional subpoenas demanding records going back 5 years. Most terrifying for local officials was the realization that Malcolm Bennett wasn't just fighting for his daughter, he was using her case to expose systematic corruption that could topple entire political networks. The man who'd built his career on methodical, devastating prosecutions was now turning those skills against the system that had failed his child. Like this video if you believe in the power of family to fight impossible odds and create change. Share it if you think every child deserves parents willing to move heaven and earth for justice. Your engagement helps stories like this reach people who need hope. Malcolm Bennett approached his daughter's case like a military commander planning a complex battle. Within 72 hours of that devastating phone call, he'd assembled the most formidable legal team in America. Attorneys who'd overturned wrongful convictions, exposed judicial corruption, and rewritten constitutional law. The emergency appeal filed in federal court wasn't just a challenge to Jazara's sentence, it was a comprehensive assault on every aspect of the prosecution. Sarah Chen's team documented 17 instances of prosecutorial misconduct, from suppressed evidence to witness intimidation. David Rodriguez compiled expert testimony from trauma specialists, juvenile justice advocates, and criminologists who could explain how abuse victims respond under extreme duress. Malcolm's investigators, the same federal agents who'd infiltrated organized crime families, descended on Chicago with the resources of the entire Justice Department. They interviewed the girls Marcus Cole had previously targeted, gathering testimony that Detective Mills had deliberately ignored. They analyzed the youth center's financial records, discovering payments from organizations with ties to human trafficking networks. Most critically, they exposed the cozy relationship between District Attorney Hawkins and private prison corporations. Campaign contribution records revealed a clear pattern. Judges and prosecutors who imposed harsh sentences on juvenile offenders received substantial financial support from companies that profited from their incarceration. The legal brief that landed on the appeals court's desk read like an indictment of the entire Cook County justice system. It documented not just the errors in Jazara's case, but a systematic pattern of corruption that had destroyed hundreds of young lives. Malcolm wasn't just fighting for his daughter. He was using her case as a weapon to dismantle a machine that fed children to corporate profits while hiding behind the facade of public safety. While his legal team worked through official channels, Malcolm launched a public awareness campaign that transformed Jazara's story from local tragedy to national crisis. He understood that winning in court required winning in the court of public opinion first, that judges and politicians only changed course when public pressure made inaction politically impossible. The media strategy was sophisticated and relentless. Malcolm granted exclusive interviews to investigative journalists who'd been tracking juvenile sentencing disparities for years. Primetime documentaries featured Jazara's case alongside dozens of similar stories, Black and brown children sentenced as adults for crimes that would earn white teenagers probation and counseling. Social media became a battlefield where truth confronted propaganda. Professional organizers helped coordinate Justice for Jazara campaigns that flooded lawmakers' offices with calls demanding reform. Celebrity endorsements from athletes, musicians, and actors brought mainstream attention to issues that had been ignored by comfortable America. But the most powerful voices belonged to other families destroyed by the system. Malcolm connected parents whose children had received harsh sentences to advocacy organizations with resources and experience. Their testimony at congressional hearings and community forums carried weight that political speeches never could. The raw pain of mothers and fathers who'd watched their children disappear into a system designed to warehouse rather than rehabilitate. Community organizing took on new urgency as neighborhoods that had lost children to unjust sentences realized they weren't alone. Churches, schools, and civic organizations that had previously accepted judicial decisions as unchangeable fate began demanding accountability. Voter registration drives targeted communities most affected by prosecutorial abuse, transforming grief into political power. The pressure extended internationally. Human rights organizations that monitored justice systems in developing nations began examining America's treatment of juvenile offenders. Foreign governments expressed concern about a country that preached democracy while sentencing children to die in prison for defending themselves against predators. Corporate sponsors of programs that promoted tough-on-crime policies found themselves facing boycotts and protests. Private prison companies watched their stock prices plummet as investors realized that public opinion was shifting against mass incarceration. Political candidates who'd built careers on harsh sentencing rhetoric suddenly discovered that voters wanted reform, not revenge. Within 6 months, Jazara Bennett's name had become synonymous with judicial reform. Her case wasn't just about one girl anymore. It represented a generation of children failed by systems that prioritized profit over rehabilitation. Malcolm's investigation revealed corruption that extended far beyond Chicago's courthouse. The network of judges, prosecutors, and private prison executives had operated for over a decade, turning juvenile courts into feeding mechanisms for corporate profits. Federal agents discovered encrypted communications between prison corporations and judicial officials, discussing quota systems for maintaining occupancy rates. The scope was staggering. Hundreds of children had been sentenced to adult facilities for crimes that should have resulted in counseling and community service. Judges received kickbacks disguised as speaking fees and consulting contracts. Prosecutors built careers on harsh sentences that generated headlines and political contributions while destroying young lives. Detective Mills's case files revealed a pattern of evidence manipulation that went back years. Exculpatory evidence routinely disappeared. Witness statements were altered. DNA evidence was lost when it contradicted predetermined narratives. The federal investigation uncovered 340 cases where similar misconduct had occurred, representing over 1,000 years of wrongful imprisonment. The youth center where Marcus Cole had operated became ground zero for exposing institutional child abuse. Federal agents discovered that complaints about inappropriate behavior had been systematically buried by administrators who feared losing funding. Multiple staff members had witnessed Cole's predatory behavior but were threatened with termination if they reported it. Most damaging was the discovery of coordination between law enforcement, prosecutors, and private prison executives. Email chains revealed discussions about maintaining market share in juvenile incarceration. Conference calls included strategies for increasing arrest rates in minority communities. Marketing materials promoted the profit potential of harsh sentencing policies. The financial incentives were explicit and horrifying. Judges received bonuses based on conviction rates and sentence lengths. Prosecutors were evaluated on their ability to secure maximum penalties, regardless of circumstances. Defense attorneys were pressured to process cases quickly, rather than mount effective defenses. Malcolm's team exposed the human cost of these policies through detailed case studies. Children sentenced to life for shoplifting. Teenagers imprisoned for decades for fights that resulted in minor injuries. Girls like Jazara, who defended themselves against predators, only to be labeled murderers by a system more interested in protecting institutional reputation than seeking truth. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Congressional hearings featured hours of testimony from victims, families, and whistleblowers who'd been silenced for years. International media covered the scandal as evidence of American hypocrisy about human rights and juvenile justice. What had started as one father's fight for his daughter had exposed a criminal enterprise masquerading as a justice system. The battle to save Jazara extracted a brutal toll on Malcolm's own life. Death threats arrived daily at his home and office. His security detail was tripled after credible intelligence suggested that private prison executives had discussed permanent solutions to their Malcolm problem. Diana Martinez hired food testers after a suspicious illness that hospitalized Malcolm for 3 days. Political pressure intensified from unexpected sources. Corporate donors who'd supported Malcolm's previous campaigns demanded he abandon the case. Fellow prosecutors warned that his crusade was making them all look bad. Supreme Court justices he'd considered friends suddenly became unavailable for their regular informal consultations. The strain on his personal relationships was devastating. Colleagues who'd worked with him for decades distanced themselves, fearing guilt by association. Invitations to social events and professional conferences dried up. His reputation as a steady, reliable prosecutor was replaced by whispers about a man who'd lost perspective and endangered his career for family loyalty. Sleep became impossible. Malcolm spent 18-hour days coordinating legal strategy while worrying about Jazara's safety in prison. She'd been placed in protective custody after receiving threats from inmates connected to Marcus Cole's network of associates. Their phone conversations were monitored, limiting their ability to maintain emotional connection during the crisis. The physical toll was equally severe. Malcolm lost 30 pounds and developed stress-related health problems that required medication. His blood pressure spiked dangerously during particularly intense court sessions. Friends worried that his determination to save Jazara might kill him before the case was resolved. On March 15th, exactly 11 months after Jazara's conviction, the Federal Appeals Court delivered a unanimous decision that would reshape juvenile justice nationwide. The ruling didn't just overturn her sentence, it declared the entire prosecution a violation of constitutional due process and federal civil rights law. Judge Patricia Meriwether's written opinion was scathing in its condemnation of the Cook County system. "This case represents a complete breakdown of constitutional protections," she wrote. "When prosecutors suppress evidence, judges ignore mitigating circumstances, and entire communities conspire to profit from the imprisonment of children, the justice system becomes an instrument of oppression rather than protection." Jazara's immediate release was ordered, along with federal oversight of all pending juvenile cases in Cook County. District Attorney Hawkins faced criminal charges for prosecutorial misconduct. Judge Harrison was removed from the bench pending investigation. Detective Mills was arrested for evidence tampering and conspiracy. The decision created legal precedent that would protect thousands of other wrongfully convicted children. But Malcolm wasn't finished. Winning Jazara's freedom was just the beginning of a larger mission, transforming the system that had tried to destroy her into one that could actually protect vulnerable children from predators and prosecutors alike. During her 11 months in Cook County's juvenile facility, Jazara Bennett discovered strength she never knew existed. The scared 17-year-old who'd entered those walls as a convicted killer emerged as something entirely different, a leader who refused to let the system break her spirit. The prison library became her sanctuary. While other inmates watched television or played cards, Jazara devoured books on law, psychology, and social justice. She studied Malcolm's old cases, learning how her father had dismantled corruption and protected the vulnerable. Each page she read fueled her determination to transform pain into purpose. Fellow inmates gravitated toward her quiet strength. Maria Santos, sentenced to 15 years for defending herself against domestic violence, found hope in Jazara's appeals process. Destiny Williams, imprisoned for a drug offense that should have resulted in treatment, discovered education opportunities through Jazara's encouragement. They formed study groups in empty classrooms, preparing for GED tests and college entrance exams. Jazara organized workshops on legal rights, teaching other girls how to identify prosecutorial misconduct and communicate effectively with court-appointed attorneys. She helped them write letters to family members, navigate the prison's bureaucracy, and maintain dignity in a system designed to strip it away. The prison administration noticed the change. Disciplinary incidents dropped dramatically in Jazara's housing unit. Educational program participation increased by 300%. Guards reported that inmates seemed calmer, more hopeful, more focused on rehabilitation rather than mere survival. Dr. Angela Foster, the facility's psychologist, documented Jazara's remarkable transformation. Most juveniles sentenced to adult facilities experience severe depression and behavioral regression, she noted in official reports. Jazara exhibited the opposite pattern: growth, leadership, and post-traumatic resilience that defied all clinical expectations. When news of her approaching release spread through the facility, dozens of girls wrote letters to Malcolm thanking him for fighting not just for Jazara, but for all children trapped by unjust sentences. March 18th dawned clear and cold, but to Jazara it felt like the first spring day after an endless winter. She walked through Cook County's gates carrying a manila envelope containing her GED certificate, college acceptance letters, and contact information for the 17 girls she'd promised to help from the outside. Malcolm waited by his car, flanked by federal marshals and news cameras, but all Jazara saw was her father. The man who'd moved heaven and earth to bring her home looked older. Gray had touched his temples and worry lines creased his face, but his eyes held the same love she remembered from childhood. Their embrace lasted 3 full minutes. Neither spoke. Words felt inadequate for bridging 11 months of separation, fear, and fighting. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying, tears of relief, gratitude, and profound connection. "I'm so proud of you," Malcolm whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for surviving, but for who you became in there." Jazara smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in almost a year. "I learned from the best, Dad. You taught me that justice isn't just about winning cases, it's about lifting people up when they're down." The cameras captured their reunion, but the moment belonged entirely to them. Recovery wasn't linear or easy. Despite her strength in prison, freedom brought unexpected challenges that therapy sessions helped her navigate. Dr. Sarah Williams, a trauma specialist who'd worked with abuse survivors for 20 years, guided Jazara through processing experiences that would have broken many adults. The nightmares came first, not about Marcus Cole, but about the courtroom, the sentencing, the feeling of powerlessness as adults decided her fate without considering her humanity. Dr. Williams helped her understand that trauma responses were normal, healthy reactions to abnormal circumstances. Rebuilding trust with Malcolm required patience from both. 11 months of separation had created distance that phone calls couldn't bridge completely. They attended family therapy sessions, where Jazara could express anger about his absence during her childhood without destroying their relationship. Malcolm learned to balance his career demands with emotional presence, understanding that being physically available mattered as much as professional success. Their breakthrough came during a weekend trip to Lake Michigan, their first time alone together since her release. Walking along the shoreline, they talked for hours about everything: her fears, his guilt, their hopes for the future. Malcolm apologized for the years he'd prioritized career over parenting. Jazara forgave him, understanding that his fight for justice had been motivated by love for her and children like her. The healing extended beyond their relationship. Jazara worked with specialists who helped her process the complex trauma of surviving abuse, defending herself, and being criminalized for that survival. She learned meditation techniques, joined support groups for young women who'd experienced violence, and slowly rebuilt her sense of safety in the world. Most importantly, she learned to see her experience not as something that had happened to her, but as something that had prepared her for a mission she was uniquely qualified to fulfill. Her pain became her power. 6 months after her release, Jazara Bennett stepped behind a podium at the National Juvenile Justice Reform Conference and looked out at an audience of lawmakers, attorneys, and activists who'd followed her story. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady and clear. "My name is Jazara Bennett," she began. and I was sentenced to life in prison at 17 for defending myself against a predator. But I'm not here to talk about what happened to me. I'm here to talk about what we're going to do to make sure it never happens to anyone else." The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. When the crowd finally settled, Jazara continued with a speech that would be quoted in law journals and policy papers for years to come. She spoke about the girls still trapped in adult facilities for crimes committed in desperation. She detailed the systemic failures that criminalize survival while protecting predators. She challenged every person in that room to examine their role in perpetuating or dismantling unjust systems. Her memoir, Defending Myself, A Daughter's Story of Survival and Justice, topped bestseller lists within weeks of publication. The book's unflinching honesty about childhood trauma, prosecutorial abuse, and the possibility of redemption resonated with readers across racial, economic, and political lines. Oprah featured it on her book club. Universities assigned it in criminal justice courses. Foreign publishers translated it into 12 languages. Speaking engagements followed: college campuses, community organizations, legal conferences, and congressional hearings. Jazara's message was consistent. The justice system must serve victims, not victimize survivors. She advocated for trauma-informed prosecution, mandatory training on abuse dynamics for judges, and rehabilitation programs that addressed root causes of youth involvement in the criminal justice system. Her advocacy organization, Second Chances Coalition, provided legal support for wrongfully convicted youth and their families. Within 2 years, they'd helped overturn 43 unjust sentences and influenced policy changes in 18 states. Jazara Bennett had transformed from victim to survivor to advocate, using her pain as fuel for systemic change that would protect thousands of vulnerable children. The Jazara Bennett case catalyzed reforms that reshaped juvenile justice nationwide. The Childhood Trauma Recognition Act required judges to consider abuse histories before sentencing minors as adults. The prosecutorial accountability standards established oversight mechanisms for cases involving child defendants. Private prison contracts were banned in 12 states, eliminating profit incentives for harsh sentences. Law schools added mandatory courses on trauma-informed justice and prosecutorial ethics. Police departments received training on recognizing signs of abuse, rather than criminalizing survival responses. Youth centers implemented protection protocols that prioritized child safety over institutional reputation. Most significantly, Jazara's case established legal precedent for considering self-defense claims in domestic violence and child abuse situations. The Bennett standard required prosecutors to prove that victims had realistic alternatives to force before charging them with assault or homicide. Within 3 years, over 200 wrongfully convicted youth had been released using legal strategies developed during Jazara's case. The ripple effects continued expanding as new advocates took up the cause she'd helped legitimize. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of incredible transformation. People who refuse to let circumstances define their destiny and turn their pain into purpose. Every subscription helps us share stories that inspire change and give hope to those who need it most. 5 years after her release, Jazara Bennett has become the voice of a generation fighting for justice reform. Her Second Chances Coalition operates in 23 states, providing legal representation, trauma counseling, and advocacy training for youth caught in the criminal justice system. The organization's success rate is remarkable. 89% of cases result in reduced sentences, overturned convictions, or alternative rehabilitation programs. Maria Santos, the domestic violence survivor Jazara mentored in prison, graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern Law School and now leads the coalition's legal team. Destiny Williams, whose drug offense conviction was overturned using strategies developed in Jazara's case, became a certified addiction counselor, helping other teenagers avoid the prison pipeline entirely. The ripple effects extend far beyond individual cases. Jazara's testimony before Congress led to the creation of the National Youth Justice Monitoring System, tracking disparities in juvenile sentencing and identifying courts with patterns of bias. Her advocacy helped establish trauma-informed training requirements for prosecutors handling cases involving minors. Schools across the country invite Jazara to speak about resilience, justice, and the power of speaking truth to authority. Her message resonates with students who feel powerless against systems that seem designed to exclude them. Teachers report that her visits inspire increased civic engagement and critical thinking about social justice issues. Corporate America has taken notice too. Major companies now fund rehabilitation programs rather than private prisons, recognizing that public opinion has shifted dramatically toward reform over punishment. The private prison industry's political influence has waned as shareholders divest from companies profiting from mass incarceration. Most importantly, Jazara's story has given hope to families facing similar battles. Parents who once felt helpless against prosecutorial abuse now know they have allies, resources, and legal precedent on their side. Her name has become synonymous with the possibility of redemption and transformation. Malcolm Bennett's journey from career prosecutor to justice reformer reflects a man who learned to see his profession through his daughter's eyes. Upon retiring as Attorney General, he established the Bennett Institute for Prosecutorial Ethics, training the next generation of prosecutors to prioritize truth over conviction rates. His new role as defense attorney shocked former colleagues, but thrilled civil rights advocates. Malcolm now represents the same vulnerable populations he once prosecuted, using his insider knowledge to challenge systemic abuse from within the legal community. His courtroom presence carries unique authority. Judges listen when the former Attorney General argues for mercy and rehabilitation. The father-daughter team has become a powerful force for change. They co-authored legislation requiring prosecutors to undergo trauma-informed training before handling cases involving minors or domestic violence survivors. They testified together before the United Nations Human Rights Council about America's treatment of juvenile offenders. Malcolm's transformation wasn't without cost. Former allies questioned his motives, suggesting that family loyalty had clouded his judgment. But his response was unwavering. "My daughter taught me that true justice requires seeing the humanity in everyone, especially those society has written off." Their relationship has healed completely, built now on mutual respect for each other's strength and shared commitment to protecting children who can't protect themselves. The reforms triggered by Jazara's case have fundamentally altered how America treats juvenile offenders. The Childhood Trauma Recognition Act, inspired by her story, requires courts to consider abuse histories, mental health factors, and developmental psychology before sentencing minors as adults. Implementation has reduced youth prison populations by 34% nationwide while maintaining public safety. Prosecutorial oversight has been revolutionized through the establishment of independent review boards in 32 states. These panels, comprising defense attorneys, social workers, and community advocates, monitor cases involving vulnerable defendants for signs of misconduct or bias. District attorneys who previously operated with unchecked authority now face regular scrutiny and accountability measures. Law enforcement training has evolved to recognize trauma responses rather than criminalize survival instincts. Police officers learn to identify signs of abuse, connect young victims with services, and understand how trauma affects behavior and memory. This approach has improved both officer safety and community relations in departments that have embraced reform. The private prison industry's influence has diminished dramatically as states reject contracts that incentivize incarceration over rehabilitation. Public funds once used to warehouse children now support community-based programs addressing root causes of youth involvement in the justice system. Mental health services, educational support, and family counseling have proven more effective and less costly than imprisonment. Judicial education programs now include mandatory training on implicit bias, adolescent brain development, and trauma-informed sentencing. Judges who once viewed harsh penalties as deterrents have learned to consider individual circumstances and rehabilitation potential. Appeals courts regularly cite the Bennett precedent when overturning sentences that fail to account for mitigating factors. Most significantly, the legal profession has embraced a culture shift toward restorative rather than purely punitive justice. Law schools teach ethics courses using Jazara's case as a cautionary tale about prosecutorial power and its potential for abuse. People often ask me if I'm angry about what happened. Jazara reflects during a quiet moment in her Chicago office, surrounded by thank you letters from families she's helped. The truth is, I was angry for a long time. Angry at Marcus for abusing me, at the system for criminalizing my survival, at my father for not being there when I needed him most. But anger is like poison. It destroys you from the inside if you hold on to it too long. I had to choose between staying bitter about the past or using my pain to create change for the future. The choice wasn't easy, but it was clear. She pauses, looking at a framed photo of herself speaking before Congress, flanked by other survivors whose cases she'd helped win. Prison was supposed to be the end of my story. Society had decided I was irredeemable, dangerous, unworthy of a second chance. But they forgot something important. They couldn't imprison my spirit or my determination to prove them wrong. My father always taught me that justice isn't automatic. It requires people willing to fight for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. I learned that lesson the hard way, but it shaped me into someone who refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. Every case we win, every law we change, every child we save from the system that almost destroyed me, that's my real legacy. Not what was done to me, but what I chose to do with what was done to me. Jazara Bennett's journey from condemned teenager to national advocate proves that our worst moments don't define our ultimate destination. Her story reminds us that resilience can flourish in the darkest circumstances, that love can triumph over hatred, and that individuals with courage can challenge entire systems of oppression. Every child deserves protection from predators and prosecutors alike. Every family deserves advocates who see their humanity before their circumstances. Every community deserves leaders who choose healing over punishment, understanding over judgment, hope over despair. Change is possible when ordinary people refuse to accept extraordinary injustice as normal. Comment your thoughts below. What stories of transformation and redemption inspire you most? Share this video if you believe every child deserves a second chance, and every family deserves advocates who won't give up on them. Today, when Jazara Bennett walks into a courtroom, it's not as a defendant, it's as an advocate for justice. Her father may have been the Attorney General, but she became something more powerful, living proof that even the harshest sentence can't destroy the human spirit.